Welcome into the Otson Audibles podcast. Matt Preem, Eric Scopel, Jared Mack on the show today, this Wednesday, and it's going to be a recruiting focused show because, guys, it's definitely not the biggest recruiting weekend ever at Oregon, but it's probably the biggest concurrent back-to-back weekends we can recall. At least I can recall from the just the sheer number of talent that's going to be on campus the next 2 weeks at Oregon. 5 stars galore, top 100 players galore, 4 stars, all taking official visits. The visitor list continues to grow, so I'm sure in a week's time, the names that we discuss on this podcast will be here, but more names will also be added to the list. It definitely feels, we'll run through some of the bigger names here in a second, but from your guys' perspective, this definitely has that Saturday Night Live vibe, that big recruiting weekend vibe during the season. These 2 weeks, this feels significantly different for Oregon.
Yeah, there's no question. I think we talked about a little in the mailbag on Monday of the shift from all these official visits taking place in September, October, November to now it's mid-June or late June, I guess, for the 24th weekend. And you've got all the heavy hitters coming in. And I think that's obviously intentional from Oregon's perspective to have, as you said, kind of a couple big weekends back to back. And you'll run through the names in a moment. And I know you said these aren't the biggest recruiting weekends in program history, and I think you're right. But the number of 5- and 4-star players that are here is pretty phenomenal, and especially when you consider that it's not just Southern California or Seattle, or of course the state of Oregon doesn't produce a ton of kids. There is one kid coming up from Central Catholic. Riley Williams will be here for the 24th, but these are players from Texas and Florida and, back east where Jared is currently. People from that neck of the woods and people from the Midwest are here. Like Miles McVeigh from Illinois will be here on the 24th. Like there's just a collection of, there's a guy who is from Finland originally. He doesn't live in Finland, but he'll be here. I mean, and he's out in the Connecticut area. So also where Jared's close to, but I just think it's really impressive when you consider how this has taken place. And I do think, just like if you followed recruiting closely or from a distance, I think either way you kind of recognize this is a shift from even 2 years ago where you try to line up all these visits for a game in October against Washington or against USC or UCLA or whatever the big rivalry quote unquote game was, to now it's June and you're getting all the guys here and you're trying to get a head start. And I think it speaks also to, I think, playing kind of the long game. You get these guys here for the official visits. You hopefully can get them back on campus maybe later for unofficial visits in the fall if that's possible financially.
I think overall, to me, it seems like there's a lot of kids who are deciding where they want to go to school. Well, I guess where they're going to commit to school originally in the summer. In the last, 2 years or so.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure if NIL has something to do with that. Like almost as if the teams and the universities, the programs themselves have some type of salary cap that they go into the season with, that the university or their boosters say. That might be the case. It might not be the case. It could just become the new trend. But this is, like both of you guys have mentioned, it's kind of wild to see this elite talent come in like the month of June. Like when I went to school at Oregon, it was always like games, during the season were the big recruiting events where they'd have 3 or 4 or 5 kids come along, maybe a couple 5-stars if they're lucky. But both weekends are chock full of high 4-stars, some 5-stars. Each weekend, Matt will just run through the list in a minute or so here. But I'm just, I know you guys both have said it's not the most impressive recruiting weekend. For either of these, like I'm trying to think of which one would be better in terms of quality and talent, because I don't remember like a lot of weekends having this high profile of guys all at once, all on campus at the same time, all within, most of them at least are in the 2023 class, the one that's coming up. I think it's up there. I don't have the memory of Oregon football like you guys both do, but I think it's in the last couple of years, at least when I've been, at Oregon and covering the team, this feels like a top 3 weekend, I think, in the Mario Cristobal era, and certainly the best one that Lanning has had since. But
it's definitely going to be one of those top 5. I think the 24th will definitely be a top 5 weekend, and then June 17th this weekend could be there. It could be there as well because they have 2 5-stars on campus.
Don't you think from just an official visit perspective, Matt, though, this is probably pretty close.
Yes.
Unofficials, they've had more guys for spring games and stuff like that. For official visits, this is pretty close.
Yes. I would agree. For purely official visits, this might be the biggest 2-weekend stretch ever. Oregon has had some just insanely stupid spring game visitor lists. I think the Saturday Night Live, the first one, was pretty. I can't recall the names exactly, but that goes really well with my argument here. But
it's also 5 years ago, Matt, so you can cut your slack.
But from an official visit standpoint, this is massive, and it's and you're right. It's probably the best ever, back-to-back stretch for sure. And the 2 weekends could compete against each other for the best ever. I think Jared's onto something with decisions being made earlier, and I wonder if this is factoring into that because you typically, I remember like 10 years ago, 12 years ago when I first started covering this for a job, like the month of June, nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Like it was literally nothing. It was a void of existence. And July, nothing really happened. And decisions were made either shortly after National Signing Day, maybe in March and April when spring games were going on. And then May, June, July, and August, literally nothing happened. And then the commits started rolling in again back in September. And flash forward 10 years, 12 years, and we're seeing everything accelerated. And I wonder if, maybe Oregon did want to get these guys on campus for official visits in the fall for their first visit, or maybe they wanted to do it for Saturday Night Live when, right before the season starts and what have you. But they probably couldn't afford it. They probably have to bring these guys in because if they don't, they're going to go see somewhere else and potentially commit down the road.
Yeah. No, I think, it feels like it's an accelerated timeline of things. And I also do kind of wonder what the reason behind that is. And maybe that's a question when we have our next recruiting analyst on the show to just kind of divulge some of that. Because I'd love to hear Greg or Brandon or Steve or one of the many other people who we have in our network who are a little bit more dialed in on some of this stuff, kind of give an explanation to it, because I'm sure they would agree with what we're saying, where the timeline has shifted a little bit. And for Oregon, I think that's probably not a bad thing. I will also say it's hard to beat an Autzen Stadium game day experience. Yes. And so I'm sure part of this is, and I know we talked about this before, you usually have these kids come on for at least 1 or 2 unofficials before taking their official visits. And I think most of the players in this list that probably applies to, maybe not all of them. I'll be curious to see how many of these guys are back for unofficial visits in the fall. Top targets, I assume, some of these guys are probably going to decide before you get to fall. But for guys that linger and don't have a decision until maybe close to signing day, I'm curious to see how many of these guys they can wrangle back around for a October or November visit as well.
All right, let's run through the list here. We won't go through everybody, but just the really heavy hitters. We'll highlight the 5-stars. So this coming weekend, Oregon has close to 10 players on campus for official visits. That number could grow. We know of 5-star David Hicks, the number 5 player in the country, the number 1 defensive tackle or defensive lineman in the country, out of Texas, out of Katy, Texas. He will be here. The other 5-star on campus this coming weekend is another player from the state of Texas, from DeSoto, Jonte Cook II, 6 foot, 170-pound guy, speedy guy. He's the 6th best receiver in the country and the 35th best player overall in the country. And then the following weekend, the visitor list is getting updated literally right before we came on here. We scratched off one 5-star, Caden Proctor. We do not believe he will be here. He is an offensive tackle, a top 10 player. But there will be a couple other guys here that are 5-star players. Mateo Ungalele, he is a 5-star defensive edge type player. Richard Young, a 5-star running back, will be here. And then Samuel Mpemba, a 5-star athlete out of Florida, will also be here. So 5 total 5-stars on campus in the next 2 weeks. Pretty significant opportunity for Oregon. And we kind of discussed this off podcast. I think we even discussed it on the podcast briefly, guys. But these next 2 weeks, I think we're all in agreement here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the next 2 weeks and the success that comes from it, whether it's immediate or down the road or lack thereof, could define Oregon's, and will probably define Oregon's 2023 recruiting class.
Yeah, when you have what's the, I don't even know what the total is. We've got so many names here listed that Matt hasn't even read, but like the total number of 4 and 5-star recruits that are here over the next 2 weekends is probably close to 24. It looks like, probably, if I were to tally it. Maybe I should do that. Maybe one of you guys can do that on the fly so we can
23 guys.
23. So yeah, right about 24. When you have that many guys on campus over 2 weekends on officials, and they're all of this type of caliber, yeah, 100% it's going to determine a lot. And you would hope you'd pull a couple of kids by the end of summer from these lists, maybe more than a couple, maybe half a dozen. And if that takes place, you set yourself up really, really well for the stretch running into the season. And I also think you look at this list and you go, we didn't mention his name, but 4-star quarterback Avery Johnson is here. I don't know if Oregon takes him, if Dante Moore's still on the table. There's been a lot of Dante Moore talk. Steve Wiltfong had on his Whip Around YouTube show, said that he thinks Oregon maybe is in position as kind of the pull team right now, maybe the leaders. If that's the case, I don't know if you take Avery or not. I think it's interesting, but like landing a quarterback is always a huge part of getting that momentum. You think about when Ty Thompson committed a couple cycles ago. And I think shortly after, it was a domino effect of a bunch of high-end skill position offensive guys, tight ends, receivers, running backs. You have it, or whatever. But it feels like if you get a couple of dominoes to fall, things could go really, really well for Oregon. And you mentioned the 5-stars. There's a bunch of 4-stars on here who are really, really good players too. Yeah. That, like, frankly, I get almost as excited. I mean, I think honestly, any of the 23 guys here, like, you would be jumping for joy for basically any and all of them. And that's kind of what speaks to it. And that's where that momentum shows up here of there's been rumblings that Oregon is kind of faring really well in the trail. You get these weekends, you get the momentum out of it, and maybe it turns into 4, 5, 6 commitments before you get through the end of August, because a lot of these guys are also taking, official visits in July and June. To other schools, but once those visits are completed, maybe Oregon ends up with, I don't know, close to 10 or 11 verbal commitments in this class instead of where they are right now. And that really is where you start to see the momentum build for the class as a whole.
Yeah, and Eric, you make a great point where it's everybody pays attention to the 5-star names, and they rightfully should, because they're 5-star prospects. Those are guys who could make an immediate contribution. We've seen in the past with plenty of players at Oregon, plenty of players across the country. But the point, Eric, that you made, there's a lot of guys on this list that I think Oregon fans and I think the coaching staff would be really happy with if they committed. Like on the 24th weekend, we didn't mention, but Jaden Wayne is going to be there. Riley Williams will be there. Miles McVay, an offensive tackle. There's a lot of guys. Deshaun Womack, he's another guy who's a defensive lineman. Just like going through the lists and looking at all these prospects, a lot of kids out of Texas, a lot of kids out of the South. I think we kind of, Eric, you talked about that too, and how they're coming over from all different parts of the country. Again, I think this all speaks volume to how well Dan Lanning and this staff is as recruiters. I think that was the rub on them going in after Oregon announced the hires and Lanning had figured out who was going to be his coordinators, is that this was a heavy recruiting staff. How they perform on the field, we'll find out after this first season, obviously. But they're living up to that hype that surrounded them. I think they might even be over, excelling at it. I think. I mean, back in January and February, just on unofficial visits, it was kind of crazy the guys that they were pulling in after being in Eugene for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, like probably not even moved into their houses here yet. And it still continues. I mean, the 24th weekend, I know I talked about it earlier, was the star power is there, and the domino effect could be there. I'm not sure how many guys Oregon could land from this weekend, but there's just been a lot of good hearings on the recruiting trail for Oregon overall. And Eric talked about Wilt Fong's whip around. He also said that for 5-star running back Richard Young, Oregon is a contender against Alabama. I think that's a huge sign, even though I think us three, have discussed in the podcast whether or not they need another running back in the class of 23. But if that's the case, you don't turn down Richard Young. Again, that speaks to Carlos Loughlin. That speaks to Kenny Dillingham and the connections that he has from the South after coaching there for a few years. I just think it's really impressive overall. And I know I'm not talking about any of the recruits, but I just think as a staff, it's just so impressive what they're doing and the connections that they made at their previous stops that have come through and helped them with their recruiting this year. And as they spend more years on the West Coast in Eugene, there'll be more Southern California connections, I'm sure, down the line. More Arizona connections too. I think it's a nice setup if you're the Oregon Ducks, having all these connections all over the place and being able to get recruits from the South, from Texas, and then also from Oregon and California come through on a June weekend.
It does feel a little like cart before the horse here when they're 27th in the country and they have 6 verbal commitments. But I kind of agree with Jared that the staff is recruiting better than anticipated. I know the results maybe aren't 100% there yet, but in a month, in 6 weeks, we could be talking about a team that's in the top 10. And, that's kind of, I think, the groundwork that's been laid the last 6 months. And now the Ducks are in a position to really kind of come out here and close the deal on some guys and really skyrocket up these rankings. And I think it also kind of proves we certainly, when Willie Taggart was at Oregon and they were humming from a recruiting perspective during the summer and early part of the season. And once the rumors of him going to Florida State kind of presented themselves, there was definitely that feeling within the fan base of oh gosh, we just got a guy that understood recruiting and things are going really well, and now they're going to slip back down. Mm-hmm. And then Cristobal got elevated and he took it to an even higher level. And when he left, there was definitely a little bit of a concern within the fan base of, how's recruiting going to operate? How are we going to match what happened over the last 4 seasons with a new head coach? There were concerns. And as we've seen, the staff has shown the ability to connect with players, to get players on campus, where I think Oregon as a program has proven that if you put forth the effort at Oregon, you're going to be in the mix for every good player there is that you want to be in the mix for.
And to the point about top 10 here, I bet if you were to take 1 5-star and 4 4-stars from this list and throw them in the class calculator, and you could probably pick basically at random, Oregon's really close to top 10, if not in the top 10. If you were to just do that, and that's where I know we're projecting here. We're not reporting. We think this is going to happen. We're not reporting dominoes falling, but hypothetically, and I don't even think it's that far of a leap to think of 23 recruits, Oregon could pull 4 or 5 of them. The kind of guys that are here and are going to be here, if you were to throw those guys in here in the class calculator, Oregon would make a huge leap up the list. And I just think you have to be really encouraged by these visits. We talk about, Matt and Jared, you both talked about kind of the concerns about if recruiting would dip with the turnovers and head coaches. And we haven't gotten there yet because Taggart had a class that was positioned to be top 10 before he left. And then Cristobal, for all his faults, and Oregon fans are going to point to a lot of them, what he did as a recruiter was really, really, really impressive every year. I mean,
it was not a fault.
It was not a fault at all. And we can get into in-game stuff we wanted to, but that's not for this podcast. But as a recruiter, he was incredible. And if Lanning is able to duplicate, I don't know if he's going to improve upon it in year one, but if he were to, let's say hypothetically, he does do that, that I think speaks a lot to not just Lanning, but also the staying power of the brand of Oregon, where you can go through 3 different coaching changes. All 3 coaches are elite individual head coach recruiters. I think Taggart's a very high-end recruiter when he's given a good, in a good spot. Obviously, Cristobal has proven he was, and Dan Lanning would as well. But I think it also just speaks to the brand. I know we're talking big picture here. We're kind of off the visit conversation, but it speaks to the brand of Oregon, where you can go through a couple coaching changes, bring in high-end recruiters, but also continue, even without that continuity, to be, tops in the conference, between 7 and 12 every year in the recruiting rankings. And if Lanning takes it up a notch, you have to be really encouraged by the possibility of actually competing for really big things, even though it's been a minute since the Pac-12's really had a legitimate college football playoff contender.
Eric, you asked that class calculator. I eliminated the 5-star and just added just 4 hypothetical additions here. And I think they're all realistic. Jaden Wayne, he is a 4-star edge player out of Seattle. He's been on campus at Oregon like 5 times. Riley Williams is a 4-star tight end out of Portland. His older brother just completed his career at Oregon. In-state guy. Avery Johnson is a 4-star quarterback from Kansas. He will be here this coming weekend. All these guys are going to be here this weekend, but Avery will, or next 2 weeks. But Avery Johnson, and then Tyler Turner, a guy that's got Oregon in his top 2 with Oklahoma. Those 4, you just add those 4. No 5-star needed. You have the 6th best class in the country.
There you go.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about here, that this weekend and the next weekend could really lay the groundwork for Oregon to make a huge jump in recruiting. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss some of the players that we like that could have the biggest impact at Oregon that are going to be visiting the next 2 weeks. All right, welcome back to the Odds and Audibles podcast, continuing our discussion on this huge recruiting weekend and back-to-back weeks for the Oregon Duck football program. We obviously just went through just the ramifications of what could happen the next couple of weeks for Oregon and the potential it has. Realistically, a top 10 class could be secured by the success of these next 2 weeks. But the players that are going to be here the next 2 weeks, there's a lot of talent here. There's a lot of players to get excited about. I think obviously if you're saying, well, what players can make the quickest impact? I think you could look at the obvious ones are the 5-stars. Jonte Cook, David Hicks will be here this weekend. Next weekend, you've got 3 more guys. And maybe that is the answer, but maybe there's other guys too that could fill in and help solve some of Oregon's holes or provide the depth that's needed to make that push to a championship. Jared, let's start with you. What guy or guys just stand out the most to you of, hey, Oregon really needs to get this guy, or this guy could make the biggest impact?
On Duck territory, I just did an article going through Oregon's offensive line room and how they stacked up as recruits. Oregon needs offensive linemen.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you what, they have some good, underclassmen talent in there, like Jackson Powers Johnson. Obviously, we have Josh Connerly coming in, Dave Iuli. Those guys are 4 or 5-star in Connerly's case. They could lose a lot of players on the offensive line, including all 5 of their starters next year. I think at least 3 or 4 of them will be gone. Like, they're just out of eligibility.
Just 4.
I think so. So you look at guys like Logan Reichert or Olas Alinen, who's a nice Loomis Chafee, Connecticut 4-star offensive lineman. Proctor isn't visiting, and according to 24/7 Sports, Oregon is not in his top 2, so you can strike him off the list. But still Miles McVay, somebody like that. Those are the few offensive linemen who are visiting. I've spoken to Miles McVay a couple times. Good kid. He's I think he's from Illinois. Little bit of a distance thing, but this will be his second time on campus. He came for an official or unofficial visit back in February, I want to say. This is a time for Agent Clem to show off his recruiting chops. Once again, former Pac-12 recruiter of the year. They're going to need offensive linemen, and obviously they can still hit that in the portal too. But you'd rather take the potential of a high 4-star or maybe even a 5-star offensive lineman with 4 or 5 years eligibility than a grad transfer offensive lineman who's just kind of a plug and fill guy. Other than that, Riley Williams, tight end out of Oregon, the state of Oregon, top 150 kid in the country, one of the top tight ends. I think he could be really, really good. I think if Oregon were to land him, that's a pretty darn good wide receiver room, combining him with Ferguson and Maliki Mataval. Spencer Webb has 2 years eligibility left, 3 years maybe. I don't know with the COVID stuff. It's up in the air. We'll figure that one out eventually. But with how Kenny Dillingham showed in the spring game, how they use their tight ends now, I think this could be an opportunity for them to start heavily recruiting tight ends. Other than that, obviously all the 5-star kids, I mean, I could say that those guys are all really good, but I like Colton Vasek. He's a 4-star defensive end out of Texas. I think he's a guy who's like 6'6", 250 or 230 is his listed weight at 24/7 Sports. He's a guy who probably wouldn't be an impact guy his first year, maybe his second year, but he's somebody who has the body and the play style who I think could do really well in the Tosh Lupoy Lanning defense. I don't want to name everybody, but there's a lot of guys who would be ideal for this Oregon team.
I think you have, though. I think you named everybody. Now I'm left going.
Who now? Yeah.
To the Riley Williams point, I think it's valuable not in for a couple reasons, but obviously really high-end player. And by the way, the state of Oregon in 23 and 24, I think has 3 combined 4-star tight ends. So really that's going to be, I think, a value position from the state that could produce several guys on the roster. But that's kind of the point I wanted to make was, Lanning is, I think it's important to make inroads in state. In the state of Oregon, they produce 2 to 4 guys that are maybe worth giving a look a year, but you want to get those 2 to 4 guys because there is a value in having the in-state players. And you hear about it all the time of the Ryan Walks and the Alex Forsyths. And there's a bunch of other guys in the roster as well, but those 2 stand out the last couple of years who've kind of been players who just maybe it means, and I'm not saying it playing football doesn't mean as much to other players who aren't from the state, but who just kind of understand some of the dynamics of playing in your home state, that kind of pride. I think someone like Riley Williams, who, again, is a big-time talent and probably the top tight end on Oregon's board, the fact that he's from the state of Oregon, I think that's a huge priority. And the fact that he's like 6'6", 230 pounds, a huge body, and you think about Oregon didn't address that position this last cycle. I think they need to address it this cycle, and I think Williams is somebody you would be really excited to land. Offensive line, like Jared said, huge position. I think the other one that stands out, and it stands out in part because you look at this list, there are 4 edge rush guys listed here. Vasek, Uangale, Wayne, and we haven't mentioned his name yet, but Blake Purchase. Those are 4 guys where I look at the roster right now in 2022, and I don't know what the future of that position really holds. Like I really like Braden Swinson and Mace Funa, but this could be Funa's last year if he wants it to be. This could be Swinson's last or second. I mean, both those guys could be off the roster by the time you get to 2024, and I think you need to retool that position. And guys like Uangale and Wayne are some of the best in the country. And if you could have a class that had both of those guys in it, you talk about what Oregon wants to be defensively and kind of the similarities you want to show to Georgia. And you look at just this most recent draft for Georgia with several players that kind of fit the physical mold of these 2 guys who are 6'5", 6'6", long, lean athletes who develop into explosive players that are in some cases, the number 1 overall draft pick, or other players from Georgia that are top 10, top 15. I mean, Georgia had so many guys in that front 7 that were drafted, and especially as first-round picks. Those are guys that could, speaking of Uiagalelei and Wayne, are 2 guys who could really fit that sort of mold at Oregon if that's the development. I think Colton Vasek's a guy. I totally agree with Jared. Like that's a huge upside pickup. I don't know if he's an immediate contributor, although he was, I think, the state of Texas's state championship defensive MVP. So it's not like he can't produce, but he's probably a little bit more raw, or maybe a little bit less of an elite athlete. So maybe it takes a little longer to kind of figure out his role. But I think the edge position is one you need to kind of get sorted out here. Oregon has a lot of edge players on its roster, but I'm not sold outside of Swinson and Funa, who again are 3rd and 4th year players who could both be gone after 22, after 20. I think both will probably be gone after 23. I think you really need to hit that position group really hard. And I think those are names to know, because this is a position that I think is going to be really valuable in what Oregon wants to do under Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy defensively.
Well, Eric stole my thunder. That was who I was going with, the edge guys.
Well, Matt, the thing is if we've got 23 names, and if Jared and I are going to go, you're not going to have anybody left. So.
You got like 6. You can put something together with that.
That is true. I don't need to go harp on too much of what you just said, because you said basically everything I was going to say. You don't have – I don't even think you know who your premier edge rusher is this season. And maybe that guy emerges. But like you mentioned, maybe it's Swinson, but maybe Swinson's gone after this year. So I don't know. I think you've got to – I think you got to land 2 of these guys that are going to be on campus for official visits the next 2 weeks. Uiagalelei, Wayne, Purchase, and then also Vasek. I just think you got to land 2 of these guys to give yourself a chance at developing that guy in the next couple of seasons. I also think linebacker, Blake Nicholson and Leona Lefu, both 4-star linebackers. I think that's important because I think we'd all be shocked if Sewell came back for a senior year in 2023. I think we would be surprised if Justin Flo is on the roster beyond the 2023 season. I wouldn't be surprised if he's not here next year. And then Jeffrey Bossa is going to be gone potentially after the 2023 season as well. And so you got to stockpile that position group, and you've got some pretty talented guys there. So I would throw those 2 names into the mix here. And then they don't need him, but Richard Young, it's not a running back. Yeah. It's not a need, but God, if you could get him, and according to Steve Wiltfong, Oregon's kind of second there. And for the longest time, no matter if it was Mike Bellotti, Chip Kelly, Mark Helfrich, Willie Taggart, Mario Cristobal, and now Dan Lanning, the longest time has been if you can get a player on campus at Oregon, your chances of landing him skyrocket exponentially. And Richard Young's been here before already. He was here for the spring game. So now you're kind of doubling down here. And I think the more opportunities you have to have guys that are that far away to be on campus, your chances improve. And if you could add him to your running back room, I know he's not a need, but that it would accelerate the development of that room at a high clip in my eyes.
Yeah.
Oregon is also Young's final official visit too, which I forgot where it was, but there was some chart about the last visit and how much that affects the commitment rate. And it's a significant thing. I mean, he's got a heck of a list. He went to Oklahoma, and then Bama, Notre Dame, Georgia, and then finishes with Oregon. Like Matt said, this is not a guy that is a need. This would be, frankly, just be a pure luxury if Oregon were to land Richard Young, because you have a solid running back room. I know there's no a clear number 1 guy, or there's no clear talent that it has to be the starter, whatever the case may be. But he'd be a welcome addition into the program, I would have to imagine.
I want to say one thing about the running back position, which I'm just going through the Oregon's all-time running back commitments. Oregon has landed about a little over a dozen 5-star commitments. 4 of them are at running back. It's the position with the highest, I guess, volume of 5-star signees in program history. They haven't landed a 5-star for about 10 years, since Thomas Tyner in 2013. Royce Freeman the year after was borderline 5-star. He was like right on the cusp as a very, very high-end 4-star. I don't want to totally discount the running back recruiting Oregon has had, but even their top 10, Sean Dollars is 9th on that list. That was in 2019. Like, you go down here, like the last couple of cycles, it takes a minute before you find a guy that Oregon has signed at running back. And Young would be, I believe, if you were to put him in here, I think he's 4th. He'd be 4th behind Jonathan Stewart, DeAnthony Thomas, and Thomas Tyner for the highest rated running back Oregon ever signed. I just think it's a position which Oregon used to thrive at. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that was their bread and butter, was the elite running back talent. And CJ Verdell and Travis Dye were here forever. It feels like it's still weird that Travis is in the conference playing somewhere else. But they haven't had this elite kind of guy. And also, you think about, and I used this comment a couple of weeks ago, or maybe more recently on the message board, about how Dante Dowdell felt like an SEC style running back. Well, Richard Young is like, he looks like Alabama running back, which is why Alabama's in a really good spot. Like, he just fits that mold. He's big. He runs like 10-8 in the 100, physical, gets, one cut and gets upfield kind of guy. Oregon could really use a player like that. And I know what we talked about when Dowdell committed. Dowdell is that sort of player. I don't want to diminish what Dante Dowdell is, but Richard Young is that kind of a player, but significantly better, right? One's a low-end 4-star. The other is the 3rd best running back in the country, I think. So a player like that would really expedite potentially what Kenny Dillingham could do offensively. I don't know if he comes in and starts, because Oregon has a ton of running back talent, and I really like a lot of the guys on campus already that are going to be here for this year. But he would step in and be the highest rated recruit by a mile compared to these guys. And I know recruiter rankings don't define who plays all the most, but running back is one of the positions where you could translate pretty quickly. So this is a guy who could come in hypothetically and again, fighting Alabama for a running back recruit is oftentimes really, 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 really challenging, especially someone who's from Florida and you're Oregon. But if this were to play out, like, I look at him as being someone who could be very impactful very early, and if not the starter in 23, at least pushing to be in that top 2 rotation as somebody who, hey, maybe 23 is Byron Cardwell's last year. Maybe he has a great season, he goes pro, but the whole year you're kind of going like, is Richard Young like on par with this junior who has been really productive so far? Like, I could see that being a conversation that happens in our hypothetical fantasy dreamland where Richard Young is an Oregon's 2023 recruit.
I agree. I mean, mid-90s all the way until Royce Freeman's career ended, there was basically the expectation, and it wasn't just at Oregon, but nationally, that Oregon had a top 2 running back in the conference every year, thereabouts. And I don't think you can say that after he left, Freeman. I loved Verdell, and I certainly am a huge fan of Dye, but neither one of those guys, I felt like, whether it was injuries, which is kind of out of a player's control, or lack of talent, could definitively say that they're a top 2 back in the conference.
They were never voted that way. They were never voted that way either. So
yeah. And so you're right, Eric. Like, going out and getting a guy like Young could get you back on that track where it's kind of expected at Oregon. Like, you're supposed to be one of the best rushing teams in the country. And I mean, what was it, like 9 years in a row or something like that? Oregon led the conference in rushing yards, and they haven't done it for a while. And so that's why I listed him. Like, you don't need him, but boy, you sure would want to have him commit on your team. I mean, it would cause some adjustments to be made from a roster makeup perspective, but it's one that you would welcome in my eyes.
Yeah, no question. No question.
All right. That's going to do it for us here on the Odds and Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. We'll be back on Friday with another edition. Until then, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.